the cursor up until you get to the desired hex value. In our case, that value would be something like this, so a little bit higher up than what I showed you. But I find this approach with the opacity much easier to manage, because if you want to change the underlying color, you don't have to redo those tints. Because of the transparency, they're done automatically for you. Okay, so we have the primary, secondary, gradient, the grays, and then a contextual color for the error messages. Now, before we end this lesson, quick word about color contrast. You see, whenever you're using text in web design, you have to ensure that it has proper contrast compared to its background, right? So that people can read it properly, especially people with visual impairments. And there are online tools that can do that for you. You can simply search for online contrast checker. Personally, I use an app that's called Contrast. Let me see if I have it open here. There it is. So with this app, I can basically sample any color from my screen, and then I can sample the background color. And that's going to give me a test result. AA plus with a contrast ratio of 3.94, that's a pass, right? So any text that's this color on a white background passes my contrast check. This is what you're always aiming for. Let's see about the secondary color. Okay, this passes as well. My primary black passes with an even higher ratio. My 75 passes. My 50 passes. But then once I get here, I get a fail because I have a too low of a ratio, which means any text that is this color on top of a white background will be hard to read because it doesn't have enough contrast. Okay, so this is something you should always check to make sure that the colors that you're using for your text have enough contrast to meet the accessibility guidelines. And there are plenty of apps. If you're using Mac OS, then I highly recommend this app. It's called Contrast. Let me see if I have an about. There we go. This is a paid app, by the way, but there are a couple more. There are a few color pickers like SIP that have an integrated color contrast checker. There are online tools, and those are probably the easiest to use for everyone. But just remember to check for color contrast before signing off on a color palette like this. All right, now for some key takeaways. When starting the design process, it's always easier to begin with the colors. Create the palette for primary and secondary colors first, then move on to grays. When creating the grays, mix in a bit of the primary color. Make sure that every color you're using for text or interactive elements has enough contrast. All right, now it's your turn to create the color palette for your version of the project. And I encourage you to be a little bit more adventurous here. While it's totally fine to follow exactly what I do, you could also pick a different primary color, for example, and a different harmony for that. If you want, you can choose a different logo for your version of the project and base your color scheme off of that. Again, it's totally fine to copy exactly what I do, but feel free to change it up every now and then and make it your own. With that said, now that we have the color part taken care of, let's move on to another fundamental aspect of web design, and that is typography. I'll see you very soon. Arguably, typography is the most important part of any design because the majority of content is usually text. So if you're not using the right typeface, font size, line height, font weight, and so on, everything else just kind of falls apart. And it doesn't really matter how good looking your website is or the rest of the website is. If your typography is subpar, that's going to translate to the other things. So how do you get started with typography? How do you pick the right typefaces and the right attributes for the fonts that you're going to be using? Well, it's a multi-step process, and I'm going to try and simplify it for you. But it all starts with choosing where you get your fonts from. Most often, you will get your fonts from foundries or font libraries, but there are also individuals that or teams that sell fonts on marketplaces like Graphic River. Envato Elements also has a huge collection of fonts, and you can easily refine your search by various font categories, spacing, size, and so on. But marketplaces aside, it's very easy to get a hold of fonts nowadays, quality fonts, I mean. And since you're a beginner, I recommend you get your fonts from either Google Fonts or Adobe Fonts. First of all, let's have a look at Google Fonts. It's a service provided by Google, and it's totally free. You can find a bunch of fonts here. Once you access it, you can browse this entire list. You can type your own sentence. Hello. And you're going to see a preview of that sentence using every single font. You can also search for specific fonts, like so. And you can also browse the various categories of fonts: serif, sans serif, display, handwriting, monospace, and so on. So if I'm looking, for example, for a monospace font, I can just select that, and I'm going to see all the options here. Now, Adobe Fonts also has a ton of fonts you can choose from, but this is paid. So you need an Adobe Creative Cloud subscription to access this. And I believe you can also access it separately, although don't quote me on that. I'm not exactly sure. But personally, I do use an Adobe Creative Cloud subscription, so I do have access to Adobe Fonts. And I think this has higher quality fonts than Google, but that's to be expected. This is a paid service. This is a free service. And even though you can find really high quality fonts here, you can find more of them right here on Adobe. And this is like exactly the same. You can go to all fonts. You do have some extra options here. You can filter by the various languages, but also by some predefined tags. For example, I don't know, let's go with cursive. And these are lists curated by the team at Adobe Fonts. And then you also have some additional properties here. Classification allows you to choose, just like Google Fonts, from sans serif, slab, serif script, and so on. But also you can filter fonts by weight, width, X height, contrast, and a couple of other things here. So you have a much more granular control over the filters in Adobe than you have with Google. You can also type in your own sample text, or you can, choose from a pre-existing one. You can modify the text size. And what I really like about Adobe Font is that once you're signed in, and you're also signed into the desktop app, the Creative Cloud desktop app, once you find a font that you like, you can activate it, and that's going to automatically download it to your computer, so it's ready to use right then and there. So that's a quick look at Adobe Fonts and Google Fonts, the two places I recommend you get your fonts from as a beginner. Okay, so let's say you picked the place where you want to get your fonts from. What's next? Well, it's time to pick the actual fonts. And for that, you need to understand the brand that you're designing for and also its end users, right? So the people that are going to be using that website, basically. That part should mostly be done in the UX stage where all the user research is happening and all that. So now you need to decide on what style of font you want to use and what would help the brand get the message across. For example, if you need to design for a luxury brand and the feeling you're trying to evoke is that of luxury and sophistication, then you might go for a serif font as the big headliner, like Swarovski is doing here. However, you wouldn't use that serif in a tech website like Stripe. Here, you would use sans serifs to evoke a feeling of modern and trust. One very important factor in font choice is readability. So after you've chosen a couple of fonts that you think would work well with your project, think about how those fonts would look like in different sizes, especially smaller sizes. Because if you're displaying all this text content of your website on a mobile device and the text is like really small and people can't read it, then what do you do? Loading time is something that we often forget about. And the thing is, the more fonts or font weights we use in our design, the slower the loading time of that website is going to be, and the bigger the impact on the performance. And yes, I know that website performance is on the web development side of things, so technically not our job. But if you're sending a developer a design that requires them to load 6 or 7 different fonts or font weights, and the website performance has to suffer because of that, well, that's on you, because you should have thought about that. See how there's an overlap between two different specializations, web development and web design. You got to be mindful about these things and always have the bigger picture in your mind, right? So yes, technically you're the designer, but you must also design the website in such a way that's not going to pose problems to the developers, right? And finally, we're talking about font attributes. So let's say that you picked your font or fonts for your project. Next, you need to decide on the font roles and their attributes. And role, meaning what font will be used for what element. For the headings, what will you choose? For paragraphs, what will it be? And attribute, meaning size, weight, line height, and so on. In regards to roles, it's very simple when you're using a single font family for the entire website, right? Because all the elements will be using fonts from that family. But when you're using 2 different font families, or as they're also called, typefaces, then it gets a bit trickier. Personally, I like to use the fonts with the greatest readability for smaller elements in my UI, like body text, buttons, menus, captions, and that sort of things. And use the other typeface on larger elements like headings. So that takes care of roles. Now we need to talk about attributes. So how do you pick the right font size, the font weight, letter spacing, and all that? Well, when it comes to font sizes, because that's probably the biggest deal, thankfully, we have something called type scales. I made a separate course on Tuts Plus on this topic, so if you want to learn more about type scales, go ahead and check that out. Naturally, I will be using type scales in this course, and I'll show you how to create them because they make our job infinitely